Good day, today you will learn about the culture and traditions of the first man. If you are interested in the history of the first man migration to Westeros, please check another video. The first men are one of the three major ethnic groups from which the humans of Westeros descend, the others being the Andals and the Rhoynar. The first men were the culture of humans who first set foot on the continent. The influence of the first men is still felt in Westeros, most strongly in the north. The Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, the king on the Iron Throne, claims to be the king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the first men. The original language of the first men was the Oldtown, a harsh, clanging language that is still spoken by the free folk and the giants north of the wall. The first men had a runic writing system. They left their runes on rocks in most of the Seven Kingdoms. Only in the Stormlands, where races older than the first men were dominant, did the first men carve their tales into the trunks of trees which have since rotted away. The exact meaning of the runes of the first men are disputed at the Citadel to this day. The first men practiced worship of several gods prior to their arrival in Westeros. These included the Lady of the Waves and the Lord of the Skies, worshipped on the Three Sisters. It was believed that sacred storms were the result of the Lady of the Waves mating with the Lord of the Skies. Their worship on the islands ended with the arrival of the Andals, who introduced the faith of the Seven. In the Kingdom of the Storm, the Sea God and his wife, the Goddess of the Wind, were worshipped. The Ironborn, who are considered by most to descend from the first man, worshipped the drowned god prior to the arrival of the Andals and continue to do so still. In addition, they also continue to believe in the drowned god's eternal enemy, the Storm God. However, following the pact between the first man and the children of the forest, the majority of the first men eventually set aside their own gods and adopted the gods of the children as their own. These children's nameless deities of stream, forest and stone are referred to as the old gods because the gods of the Andals, referred to as the new gods, replaced them in all but the north of Westeros. The worship of the old gods is not accompanied by priests, holy texts, songs of worship and barely any rites. Prayers are done in silence. Worshippers of the old gods visit Godswoods, groves contained within castles throughout the Seven Kingdoms, where a hot tree can be found. These trees, which have faces carved into them, are considered to be sacred. Worshippers believe the old gods watch through the trees. The hard trees are usually weirwoods, and Godswoods are often the only places where living weirwoods still remain until one goes north of the wall. Although the views of the first men on polygamy are not known, thraldom used to be a common practice amongst the first men before the arrival of the Andals. The exact laws of inheritance followed by the first men have not been stated. Several of the groups that descended from the first man practiced rule by consensus or election among several lords and chieftains in council. The Ironborn often chose their kings through a kingsmoot, where each man who owned and captained a ship might cast a vote for the new king. In Dorne, before the coming of the Rhoynar or the Andals, the first men were divided into numerous petty kingdoms. One of the High Kings of Dorne ruled the lands near the mouth of the Greenblood. This High King was elected in a non-hereditary fashion from among a dozen noble families. This practice eventually collapsed when a dispute concerning an election set the families to war against one another. The free folk beyond the wall are led by chieftains. At several times during history, they have united behind a non-hereditary overchief known as the King Beyond the Wall. The Whale Mountain clans are led by chieftains as well. In council, they insist that every man or woman must be allowed to have their voice heard. According to Archmaester Aaron, the ancient marsh kings of the Crannogmen of the Neck were considered to be a first among equals, often thought to be touched by the old gods. The custom of the guest rite is both a sacred rule and an ancient one. The guest rites are taken very seriously both beyond the wall and in the Seven Kingdoms, and although it looms less in the southern kingdoms, it is held most dear in the north. There, breaking guest rite is punished similarly to the direst of treasons. The most common way of receiving the hospitality called guest rite is by eating bread and salt. Once guest rite has been offered and accepted, the guests and hosts are protected from harm by one another for the length of the stay. Guest gifts can be given on the day the guests depart, possibly as the means of ending the protection of the guest rite. Guest gifts are no longer given by all lords, however. The first man believed that the person who condemned another to die should be the one who wields the sword. House Stark practices this belief still. The first man wielded bronze swords and great bronze axes. They were armored in bronze as well, carrying large leather shields. At the time of Andal invasion, the first man still fought in bronze. However, in time, Andal blacksmith taught the first man to arm and armor themselves in iron instead. The first man rode horses into battle. Although not a seafaring people, the first men did use fishing boats and trading cogs, though these were not matched for long ships with great sails and banks of oars. When the first men first settled in Westeros, they cut down the forests, began to plow the fields, and constructed roads through the hill country. The farms and villages the first men built were protected by stout moat and bailey forts, which were later on replaced by stone castles. The first men also raised up ring forts, ruins of which can still be found at numerous places, including the Feast of the First Man and Seal Rock at White Harbor and the Stormlands. On Sea Dragon Point still stands ruins of ancient strongholds of the first man. The first man and later on the early Andals built square towers and keeps. In the Reach, Andal stonemasons taught the first man how to further strengthen the defenses of their castles and holdfasts. The first men interred their dead in barrows, which can be found everywhere in the north, for example the Great Barrow of Barrowtown, where the first king of the first man is said to have been buried. The Barrowlands contains wide plains of flatness, which are relieved by long, low hummocks, the barrows of the first man. Some of the barrow fields contain monuments. The Starks of Winterfell bury their deceased family members in the crypts of Winterfell, located beneath the castle. The Boltons of the Dreadfort similarly bury their deceased beneath their castle. The Blackwoods, originally from the north, bury their dead beneath the weirwood of Raventree. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Also, subscribe to my channel to be notified when a new lore video is released. Thank you again and see you soon.